Michael Harrow hadn't planned on acknowledging anyone. He'd been watching a bead of condensation crawl down his water glass, counting the seconds between glances at the door, when that quiet voice slipped across the space between tables. It wasn't loud or bright or flirtatious. It sounded like someone asking permission to speak at all. Michael lifted his gaze slowly, irritation ready, then stalled. She sat alone at the next table. Phone face down. Shoulders loose but tired. Not poised to impress. Not broadcasting availability. Just there. Just honest. Claire Bennett hadn't set out to disturb anyone's evening. She had checked her phone one last time, found nothing, and felt the silence fold in around her. Sometimes silence felt heavier than rejection. Saying nothing had begun to feel worse than risking a small truth. So she'd let the words out. If stories about quiet courage and ordinary kindness mean something to you, stick around. Moments like this are where everything begins to shift. Michael hesitated before answering. People usually talked at him, not with him. They expected direction, certainty, a solution. This woman expected exactly nothing. That threw him. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "Seems that way. No excuses, no jokes." Just two strangers naming the same small disappointment. Somehow it felt dangerous. The waiter glided past, eyes carefully sliding over the two tables that had been set for evenings no one else had shown up to share. The restaurant hummed low around them. Muted music, warm lighting, a place designed for conversations people would remember. Michael hadn't noticed any of it before. Now every detail felt suddenly near. Claire smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because the truth had finally broken the surface. She didn't ask his name. Didn't offer platitudes. She just stayed where she was, fully present. And in that moment, simple presence felt like rarity. Michael didn't know it yet, but that single sentence had already cracked something inside him. Not his heart, not his future. Something quieter he'd ignored for years. As they sat there in a silence that no longer felt solitary, neither realized how large this small moment actually was. It was the kind of turning point life hides in plain sight, unremarkable until everything after it begins to rearrange itself. Michael Harrow, 42, self-made millionaire, CEO of a mid-sized financial technology firm that moved millions of dollars every day, was the kind of man people called laser-focused when they meant emotionally out of reach. The money moved. The numbers worked. The company grew. He usually ate dinner alone. Success had filled every line of his calendar and quietly hollowed out everything around it. That night in the restaurant wasn't a celebration, and it wasn't a date he'd been eager about. It was homework. His therapist had said, calmly and without drama, that isolation had become his refuge. He never told people he was exhausted. He told them he was busy. It was a useful lie. There were always board meetings, investor updates, flights, deadlines, excuses not to sit still with himself. Now, stranded at a table waiting for a stranger who never appeared, he felt a bleak confirmation. Even when he tried to step outside his routine, life didn't bother to meet him there. He wasn't angry. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Across from him in the next row of tables, Claire carried a different kind of weight. At 34, she wasn't lonely in the cliché way people imagine single mothers to be. Her days were packed. Part-time work at a local nonprofit, lunches assembled before sunrise, homework checked in the evenings, routines built to make sure her 11-year-old son, Evan, felt safe in a world with very little built-in gentleness. Dating had drifted to the bottom of her priorities. Not because she didn't crave connection, but because over time, peace had become more valuable than excitement. Agreeing to a blind date had felt reckless and oddly hopeful. A coworker had insisted she deserved something that existed just for her, even for one evening. Claire had said yes mostly because she wanted to believe that part of her life wasn't sealed shut forever. Now, with the minutes stretching and no explanation arriving, she didn't feel rejected. She felt exposed, like she'd stepped outside the sturdy system she'd built, and remembered how fragile it really was. Their conversation didn't begin with flirtation or charm. It began with the truth. Michael noticed it immediately. Claire wasn't trying to fill the air with nervous chatter or polish herself into some shinier version. She spoke the way people do after they've grown tired of performing. That unstudied honesty tugged his defenses down without his consent. For once, he wasn't the man with the answers. He was just another person who'd been left waiting. Claire sensed that too. There was a tension in him, something carefully ordered. She recognized it from people who carried the weight of responsibility but had never learned how to set it down. She didn't ask what he did. She didn't need to know. What mattered was how he listened. As if nothing she said was filler. As if even her small observations had substance. They kept the topics light. Bad coffee, missed buses, stiff introductions that had gone wrong. Underneath, something deeper moved unspoken. Both of their lives had been shaped by old decisions. Both had learned how to stand without leaning on anyone. Sitting there together, they weren't fixing anything. They were just allowing themselves to be seen, if only for a few minutes. That alone felt unfamiliar. As the conversation unfolded, Michael felt a band ease around his chest. It wasn't relief or attraction so much as recognition. He couldn't remember the last time a conversation hadn't been about outcomes or expectations. Claire didn't need him to be impressive. She didn't need him to solve anything. She was simply there. Somehow, that was harder for him than any boardroom negotiation. Claire, for her part, noticed the ease in the pauses. She didn't feel pressed to entertain him or justify her choices. The absence of that pressure felt like a gift. Still, a part of her stayed ready. Experience had taught her that comfort could vanish if she leaned too far, too fast. She repeated to herself that this was just a moment. Nothing more. Even as it began to mean more than she expected. What neither of them could see was that this quiet thread of connection was already shifting the path beneath them, not into romance or rescue, but towards something slower and more dangerous to the tidy lives they'd both defended. On the table in front of Claire, her phone lay still and dark, for reasons neither of them understood yet, as the evening waited for its turn. Her phone did not explode with sound. It simply lit up, screen glowing gently between them. Claire knew the sender before she finished glancing at the notification. Evan's school. Parents learn to read those updates in half a heartbeat. She didn't panic, but her focus tightened. Before she even opened the message, she sensed the evening wouldn't stretch as far as she'd quietly hoped. The update was straightforward. Evan had stayed late for an after-school activity and missed the last bus. He was safe sitting in the front office supervised, but he couldn't stay there indefinitely. No crisis. No danger. Just a small deviation from the schedule she depended on. For Claire, that was enough. Her life was built on reliability. When the pattern bent, she showed up. Michael noticed the shift in her right away. Years of gauging rooms had made him hypersensitive to tiny adjustments. Claire wasn't panicked, just abruptly elsewhere. Her shoulders firmed slightly. Her gaze turned inward, already running through what needed to happen next. He didn't rush in with questions. He waited. That restraint mattered more than anything he might have said. Claire explained succinctly, Evan, the missed bus, the office. No apology, no dramatics. This was just how her life worked. Evan wasn't a burden. He was the center of the structure she'd chosen. She collected her things unhurriedly, giving weight to the moment even as she prepared to leave it. When Michael automatically offered to pick up the check, the gesture came out of habit rather than performance. Claire shook her head, calm and certain. She paid her part, stood, and met his eyes with something like gratitude. Not for the meal, but for the space they just shared without pretense. Before turning away, she paused and told him, quiet and clear, that the evening, though interrupted, hadn't been a waste. She thanked him for hearing her without trying to fix her. For a second, the rest of the restaurant faded, and those words hit him more deeply than he knew how to show. He watched her walk out, feeling a new unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He wasn't sad she'd left. He was unnerved by how much it mattered that she had. The empty chair across from him looked different now, not abandoned but interrupted, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. Outside, Claire stepped into the cool air without looking back. She wasn't trying to turn the moment into a story, but she carried it with her, quietly lodged between responsibility and longing. Neither of them understood that this simple, unquestioned choice, to leave, to let go, to do what needed doing, had already altered both of their trajectories. Michael stayed long after Claire was gone, not frozen in heartbreak, just strangely unmotivated to move. The chair opposite felt louder than the conversation itself had been. He realized how rare it was for someone to walk away from him without wanting anything.
no favors,
No access.
no implaído.
The realization unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. On the drive home, city lights streaked past the windshield. His mind kept circling back, not to specific lines of dialogue, but to the tone of her voice, the ease of the pauses, the way she had refused to manage him. He was used to people bending themselves around his presence, consciously or not. Claire hadn't bent at all. That lack of adjustment made him feel oddly seen, as if someone had looked past the armor he'd long mistaken for himself. The next morning he stepped back into the current of his usual life. Schedules, forecasts, the drumbeat of expectations. His day filled with meetings that demanded clarity and decisiveness. Yet beneath the practiced rhythm, something had slipped out of place. He found himself noticing what he usually filtered out: the fatigue in an assistant's eyes, the brittle silence between colleagues, the subtle moments when people needed something more human than efficiency. Claire's day followed its familiar tracks. Wake up, pack, work, parent. But pieces of her attention kept drifting back to the restaurant. She didn't spin fantasies or frame it as the start of something. She no longer allowed herself that habit. Still, a softness lingered, an echo of having been seen without meticulously explaining herself. For someone whose default setting was strength, that memory stayed with her longer than she expected. That afternoon, picking Evan up, she watched him pour out stories from his day, his thoughts tumbling on top of one another. She listened fully, rerooting herself in the life she'd built. Responsibility didn't feel like a sentence to her. It felt like a decision she made every day. Yet even as she smiled at her son's enthusiasm, she couldn't ignore the quiet ache beneath it, the reminder that she existed as more than this one role. That night in his penthouse, Michael skipped dinner without noticing. He stood at the window with his phone in his hand, scrolling at nothing, then setting it down again. The silence that had once felt like shelter now bordered on isolation. He wondered when success had stopped meaning security and started meaning distance. They both went to bed carrying the same unnamed weight. Neither reached out. Neither looked for the other. Instead, they sat with the discomfort of feeling vulnerable with no plan to relieve it. It was the kind of emotional stillness most people drown out with noise. What neither realized was that this quiet recalibration wasn't pushing them apart. It was drawing their separate choices into alignment, inching them toward a decision neither had set out to make. Somewhere between routine and reflection, their connection deepened without contact. The next shift arrived without fanfare. Weeks later, buried among corporate agendas, Michael signed off on a long-term investment program for underfunded public schools. An infrastructure and support initiative that made sense on paper. Strategic philanthropy, good optics, measurable impact. In reality, it would put him into spaces he usually only visited through spreadsheets. He decided to attend the first school visit himself, without cameras or press releases. He walked the halls while administrators explained grant timelines and facility upgrades. He nodded in the right places, but his attention kept drifting to the life buzzing around him. Children streamed past, unconcerned with who he was. Their world did not rearrange itself because he'd entered it, and that disorientation struck deeper than he expected. He paused when he saw a boy helping a maintenance worker carry a heavy box down the hallway. The worker hadn't asked. The boy didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He just noticed a need and stepped in. Michael stopped walking. He watched the moment as if it were happening in slow motion. When the worker thanked him, the boy offered a quick smile and jogged toward his classroom, already late. The exchange was over before anyone else registered that it had happened. To everyone else it was nothing. To Michael it felt deliberate, like a lesson he'd stumbled into. He lingered in the hallway longer than made sense, replaying that image, trying to understand why it had lodged so firmly in his mind. Later that afternoon, curiosity nudged him to ask for the student roster. He scanned it idly until one name halted him. Evan Bennett. Recognition rolled in slowly, then all at once. His chest tightened as the memory caught up. Claire's face, her careful steadiness, the way she'd spoken of routine and responsibility without bitterness. He realized he'd never asked her last name that night. Now he knew why that empty chair had felt like an unfinished sentence. Meanwhile, Claire began noticing subtle changes at Evan's school. Supplies arriving that had been missing for years. Programs added. Teachers a little less worn down. She didn't chase the how too hard. Life had taught her that good things sometimes slipped in quietly, and interrogating them too aggressively could turn gratitude into suspicion. So she focused on Evan's growing enthusiasm instead. Michael, however, couldn't separate the upgrades from the boy in the hallway. Evan's instinctive kindness wasn't the result of a funding program. It had been formed at home by example, one ordinary day at a time. That realization shifted something fundamental in him. Systems mattered. But people formed the heart of what systems were supposed to protect. He surprised his team by requesting a more active role in the initiative. He wanted regular visits, deeper context, more than charts and timelines. This wasn't penance. It wasn't image management. It felt like alignment. For the first time in years, his work touched something undeniably human. Somewhere between observation and intent, a new decision began to take shape, one that would eventually require him to stop watching from the edges. He didn't announce his increased involvement. He simply reworked his schedule and started showing up. Not for quick tours followed by polished reports, but for hours at a time. He listened while teachers spoke about burnout and impossible choices, while students talked about feeling invisible, while staff described doing too much with too little. He let their words land without cutting in, realizing how little of this ever reached the boardroom. As the weeks passed, his presence became normal but never imposing. He learned names, routines, small details that rarely appeared in any report. He noticed the way a room shifted when someone felt heard rather than evaluated. It slowly dismantled one of his oldest beliefs, that efficiency was the highest form of respect. He began to see that sincere attention could change a space more deeply than authority. From a distance, Claire watched these same changes ripple through Evan. He came home brighter, more self-assured, more willing to share his world. Teachers reached out more often, not only with concerns, but with hopeful updates. Claire appreciated it all, but held her gratitude carefully. She'd learned how quickly stability cracked if it relied on the wrong reasons. The first time she recognized Michael again was at dismissal, standing near the fence in plain clothes, hands in his pockets, taking in the rush of parents and children without inserting himself into it. At first he was just another adult in the crowd. Then his profile clicked into place in her memory. Her reaction wasn't a jolt of excitement. It was a pause. He caught her looking, met her eyes with a small nod instead of a smile, and didn't move a step closer. He left the choice of what came next entirely with her. He approached only after she acknowledged him. He talked about the school, the students, how easily small acts went unnoticed. He didn't mention his company, his position, or the money behind the changes.
Claire listened, weighing intention.
She noticed what he didn't say more than what he did, that he never positioned himself as the savior of their situation. That mattered. Their exchanges stayed grounded and unsentimental. Observations about kids, routines, and what it meant to raise someone who saw people instead of power. When Claire talked about teaching Evan to watch for where he was needed, Michael didn't pivot the conversation back to himself. He just listened. That balance created a quiet sense of safety neither of them was in a hurry to label. Not intimacy, but the beginning of trust, built not through emotion but through consistency. Back at the office, his colleagues grew uneasy. Time spent at schools didn't translate cleanly to charts or deals. Emotional involvement, they hinted, made leadership unpredictable. He didn't argue. He let their concerns pass through him and kept showing up anyway. The opposition he faced wasn't only from others. It was internal. A deliberate choice to dismantle the distance he'd once believed was necessary to lead well. Every classroom, every hallway conversation, demanded his presence without control. It was a new discipline. As he and Claire crossed paths more frequently, they could both feel a low, steady weight building. Less like tension, more like responsibility. Each encounter suggested an eventual moment when standing back would no longer be neutral. Neither wanted to name that yet. But both understood that once kindness became visible, it often asked for more than silence. The moment their connection deepened didn't happen behind closed doors. It unfolded in public, where neither of them could manage the story being told. At a small school event showcasing student projects, Evan stood in front of a crowded room and presented his work with a confidence that startled Claire. From the back, she watched his posture, his voice, realizing how quietly he had grown. Michael stood along the sidewall, trying not to step back as attention pooled around the children. Evan talked about teamwork, about noticing when others needed help, about how small everyday choices could keep people from feeling alone. He didn't talk about funding or leadership. He talked about behavior. Michael felt something twist in his chest, recognition of values he dimly remembered but rarely voiced. Afterward, Evan spotted him and walked over, thank you on his lips. Not awestruck, not deferential, just sincerely appreciative of the support for the school. Claire saw them together and felt a sharp unease. She had spent years making sure Evan's sense of worth came from who he was and what he did, not from proximity to anyone with power. Gratitude was fine. Indebtedness was not. She joined them, voice even but unmistakably firm. She thanked Michael for his role in the school's growth, while making it clear Evan's kindness had existed long before any of it. Michael heard what lay beneath her words and did not push back. He redirected the credit to the staff and students, carefully stepping out of the center of the story. That exchange shifted something important between them. Claire realized he wasn't trying to leverage generosity into influence. He wasn't angling to become essential. He was, in fact, respecting her boundaries. Michael saw the quiet steel in her refusal to romanticize help. She wouldn't allow goodness to rewrite the story of how hard they'd worked to stand on their own. They didn't need to agree on everything. Their values had found alignment where it mattered. Later that night, alone, Michael replayed Evan's words and the look in Claire's eyes. Supporting the school no longer felt like a well-designed initiative. It felt like a commitment to protect spaces where children learned what it meant to show up for each other. The work shifted in his mind from obligation to choice. At home, Claire examined her own reaction with the same honesty. She recognized how quickly she braced when power entered her orbit. She also saw that when challenged, Michael had stepped back instead of pushing forward. He hadn't tried to win her over. He'd simply respected the line. Trust didn't fall neatly into place, but it moved closer. Not because of promises, but because of how he behaved when it would have been easy to do otherwise. Their lives were no longer merely running parallel. They had intersected in a way that couldn't be undone. From here on, any attempt to pull away would require intention. Over the next weeks, the pressure around them became more visible. For Claire, it arrived as distance disguised as politeness. Other parents grew more careful around her. Conversations slowed when she approached. Compliments about Evan's progress were followed by questions that braided gratitude with suspicion. She'd seen this pattern before. People trying to make sense of generosity by assigning motives, by assuming unspoken deals must exist somewhere. It unnerved her more than open criticism would have. She had spent years building a life where Evan's confidence came from effort, not from any perceived advantage. Now she worried that support, however pure, might start rewriting the story others told themselves about her son. Nights found her replaying offhand comments, measuring her reactions, trying to decide whether she was overprotective or simply safeguarding something delicate and necessary. The vigilance wore on her, not because it made her weaker, but because it demanded constant attention. Michael faced erosion of a different sort. In meetings that had once felt predictable, he began to hear the subtext beneath the polite language. Emotional involvement blurred boundaries, they said. Complicated strategy. Stability in his world had always meant staying unmoved by human detail. Years earlier, he would have agreed without a second thought. That was what disturbed him most. He saw with new clarity how easily an organization could treat humanity as a problem to be managed. Emotional distance tightened decisions. Presence made them messy. Walking away would restore everyone's confidence in him. Staying would mean tolerating ambiguity and doubt. For the first time, that tension felt less like a threat and more like an honest measure of who he wanted to be. During these weeks, the space between Michael and Claire grew quieter, but not colder. When they did talk, their words were careful and specific. Claire voiced her fears plainly, about dependence, perception, about how deeply she valued Evan's ability to stand on his own. Michael didn't try to reassure her out of her worries. He didn't counter or argue. He listened, understanding that trust couldn't be negotiated into existence. It would either grow from what he consistently did or it wouldn't. That restraint created a thin but real equilibrium. Evan, sensitive in the way children often are, picked up the tension without understanding its origin. One evening while they worked on a project together, he asked Claire if helping people always made everything more complicated. The question stunned her for a moment. She answered slowly that sometimes doing the right thing created more questions instead of less. That didn't make it wrong. Saying it out loud settled something in her that had been shaking. Michael's clearest test came when a senior investor flatly stated that letting emotions steer decisions undermined authority. The remark followed him long after the meeting ended. He knew that one quiet retreat would restore their full confidence. A single decisive step back would signal that nothing had really changed. But now that option felt dishonest. The harder path, staying present, accepting the consequences, felt like the only one he could live with. As pressure built on both sides, their connection stretched thin but did not snap. They both understood that visible kindness came with weight attached. The question was no longer whether what they shared mattered. It was whether they were willing to protect it without shrinking it into something easier, safer, or smaller. Clarity arrived in an unexpected form. A letter never meant to be found. At a modest school fundraiser, Claire had been asked to help sort donated materials in a small office off the main hallway. While organizing folders and envelopes, she discovered a handwritten page tucked inside a stack of financial reports. She might have put it back without reading, but her son's name appeared halfway down the first paragraph. Her chest tightened. She read on. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone. Michael had written it months earlier, alone late at night, trying to understand why a single hallway moment had stayed with him while so many larger events had faded. He described watching a boy help without being asked and realizing that repeated, small examples of that kind of behavior shaped a person more deeply than opportunity ever could. He didn't praise Evan as extraordinary. He held him up as evidence that someone somewhere was quietly doing something right. Then he wrote about Evan's mother, the woman he'd met once briefly. How she'd spoken with unadorned honesty. How that short exchange had reminded him of the person he'd been before he wrapped himself so tightly in success. He admitted he hadn't reached out after the restaurant, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to disturb a life anchored in boundaries and stability. The letter wasn't a profession of love. It was reflective, spare, vulnerable without asking for anything in return. When Michael realized Claire had read it, he didn't scramble for an explanation. He didn't snatch it from her hand. He stood there, still, shoulders loose, and allowed the silence to expand between them. He told her simply that she wasn't meant to see it, and that every word in it was true. For the first time since the night they'd met, he spoke directly about his loneliness. About how achievement had gradually replaced connection until he hardly noticed the switch. About how seeing Evan, and then seeing Claire again, had woken something he'd long assumed was gone. Claire responded in the only way she knew how, plainly. She admitted that she had spent years guarding herself against imbalance. Against relationships where one person's power or generosity quietly rewrote the rules. Reading the letter had forced her to consider that sometimes, presence might come without strings. She didn't extend immediate trust. She didn't step forward into certainty. But she did acknowledge the effect his words had on her. That alone marked a shift. The conversation didn't resolve all their questions. It reframed them. Their connection was no longer a vague maybe hovering at the edges. It had shape now.
Intention.
Michael understood, more clearly than ever, that if he remained in their orbit, he could not do so halfway. And Claire understood that keeping him at a distance would cost her as much effort as allowing him, cautiously, to stand closer. Neither option felt easy. Both felt honest. The quiet that followed was heavy but not hostile. Claire realized that what unsettled her most wasn't what he'd felt. It was how carefully he had handled it. He had chosen restraint instead of pursuit, observation instead of interruption. That choice pushed against one of her oldest beliefs, that attachment always came with hidden demands. For years she had equated distance with safety. Now she was being invited, gently and without pressure, to reconsider that equation. Michael, standing opposite her, felt more exposed than he had in any boardroom. He was used to controlling information, managing perceptions, editing what parts of himself others could see. Here there was nothing to manage. No pitch to land. No outcome to steer. All he could do was remain and let Claire decide what his honesty meant. That helplessness felt heavier than any professional risk. She noticed that he didn't cross the room, didn't fill the gaps with promises. That lack of pressure told her this wasn't about convincing her, only about offering the truth. For the first time she realized how rare it was to be given full freedom to choose, without subtle nudging in either direction. The realization steadied her more than certainty would have. For a brief moment, they hovered between old habits and new possibilities. Neither reached for comfort, neither rushed toward labels. Their mutual restraint became its own kind of respect, allowing what was real between them to exist without a demand for immediate definition. Then the noise of the fundraiser seeped back in. They stepped out of the small office and into the ordinary commotion of tables, voices, and music. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. The letter hadn't created intimacy. It had stripped away assumptions. From that point on, whatever grew between them would do so on purpose, not by accident. That fragile honesty was enough to carry what came next. That night, as they settled at home, Evan picked up on the subtle difference in his mother's attention. She seemed less braced, more thoughtful. When he asked what had changed, she told him that sometimes people show you who they really are when they don't think anyone's looking. That seeing that didn't mean you gave them full trust right away, but it did mean you owed them respect. Michael went home without expectations, but with more clarity than he'd had in years. He understood now that kindness required responsibility, not entitlement. Whatever followed would have to be built slowly, through patience and steadiness, not dramatic gestures. He knew this wasn't about merging lives overnight. It was about finally meeting each other honestly. From this point forward, silence would no longer keep them safe. The next step would have to be intentional, and that intention would define whether what they had became something lasting, or remained a lesson about how to choose differently. Resolution didn't crash into their lives. It arrived gradually through ordinary decisions that meant more than they looked. Michael didn't pull away from the school to prove detachment, and he didn't double his visits to prove devotion. He kept the same steady presence, refusing to turn consistency into spectacle. Claire noticed this and felt some inner unease. Reliability, she realized, often mattered more than intensity. Over the following weeks, their conversations opened up. They spoke about limits and fear as calmly as they spoke about schedules. Michael shared how success had taught him to engineer outcomes, but never to sit in uncertainty. Claire shared how independence had shielded her, but sometimes left her starved for support. They didn't frame these truths as wounds to be healed. They presented them as simple facts of their lives. Evan remained the anchor between them, the clear center. He kept thriving at school, blissfully unaware of the quiet emotional shifts happening around him. Claire watched how Michael interacted with her son. Respectful, measured, careful not to overstep. He never tried to claim a role that wasn't his. That restraint reassured her more deeply than any speech about boundaries ever could. It showed her that care didn't need to cross lines to be real. Michael, for his part, practiced a new way of being. He listened more than he spoke. He stopped trying to steer every moment toward a result. He let things unfold without insisting they lead somewhere specific. It felt strange, occasionally uncomfortable, but it also felt true. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't chasing meaning through accomplishment. He was letting connection exist on its own terms. One evening after a school event ended and the crowd thinned out, Michael and Claire walked side by side toward the parking lot. Evan strode a few steps ahead, swinging his backpack, confident and at ease. The simplicity of it struck them both. Their lives didn't need rewriting. They just needed to be lived with a little more honesty. Near the cars, Michael asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime, not as a capital D date, but as a continuation of the conversations they'd been having in hallways and parking lots. Claire didn't answer right away. She weighed the question against everything she'd spent years protecting. When she finally said yes, it wasn't because she felt swept away. It was because the invitation matched a pace she trusted. That difference mattered to both of them. The coffee that followed held no grand declarations. It was quiet, unhurried, rooted in curiosity instead of expectation. They talked about work, routines, the moments that had shaped who they'd become. Every story they exchanged added a little more substance to the growing understanding between them, that connections built slowly with care often lasted longer than those built on intensity. They didn't rush to label what they were. They allowed it to exist as it was. When they parted that afternoon, there was no dramatic goodbye. Just a shared awareness that something real had begun. Not a rescue, not a promise inscribed in stone. A choice to remain open. The kind of choice that doesn't close loops neatly, but leaves space for things to grow. As they stepped back into their separate lives, both carried the same quiet conviction. That kindness, when chosen deliberately, had a way of gently altering the future. Thanks for staying with this story. If it spoke to something in you, you're welcome to stick around for more. Stories that remember the quiet goodness still threading its way through the world.